Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 216, The Youth of Emperor Maximilian I, which is also episode 14 of season 11, The Fall and Rise of the House of Habsburg. Now, what is it like to grow up the son of the emperor? For most of the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire we have covered so far, no idea. There are scarce reports about the way princes grew up. I'll save for tales like that the Emperor Ludwig the Bavarian was kidnapped by his pet monkey when he was a baby. But now, as the late Middle Ages give way to the Renaissance, we can see the boy who would be king at play, being fed by his nursemaid and pretending to be a knight at a tournament. And even better, this emperor is Maximilian, the last knight, one of the most iconic rulers of the time. Come along as we descend into the delights and terrors of his epic childhood, complete with myth-making in drawings and woodcuts. But before I start, just a few things. Part 2 of the Barbarossa series I did with the history of Venice and the history of Italy is out, and it's well worth listening to. I've uploaded the full 3 episodes, both on the Patreon feed and on the website membership site, so you can listen to it advertising free. And as always, if you want to keep this show as it is, go to historyofthegermans.com/support and become a patron as Ralph M., Wei Chun L., Stephen M., Frank McC., Edward H., Hermuski, Christopher G., and Jonathan G. have already done. And with that, back to the show. So far, in this podcast, we have not talked much about the childhood of the key protagonists. The only case I can remember is that of Karl IV and his relationship with his father, John the Blind King of Bohemia. And most of what we know about his childhood and his relationship with his father came from reading between the lines of his autobiography and the fact that he did consistently 180 degrees the opposite of his father. With Maximilian, things are very different. We hear about his fears as a little boy during the siege of Vienna, him getting stuffed with sweets by his mum, and his early memories. There's even a woodcut showing him just playing for fun. And as we're talking about childhood in the late Middle Ages, it may be worthwhile looking into this question, whether these pre-modern people loved their children as much as we do, or at least we intend to do. And this debate goes back to a French historian, Philippe Arié, who published L'Enfant et la vie familiale sous l'Ancien Régime in 1960, a book that's better known by its English title, Centuries of Childhood. Arié looked at the depiction of children in art before 1500, where they often appear in adult dress and act as miniature adults. And the same he thought was the case in literature, where childhood is very rarely a topic and where it is mentioned, children are disposable, effectively lesser adults. And indeed, if you look at donors on medieval altarpieces, their children tend to wear the same clothes as the adults, just smaller. And even the Christ child is often shown detached from the Virgin with a much older face. It wasn't before the early Renaissance in Italy that Jesus is shown as a human baby clinging to his mother. And from this he concluded that childhood is a more recent idea and that parenting in the Middle Ages was largely detached. Nuclear family bonds of love did not exist in the era, and children died too easily to allow parents to get too emotionally attached to them. They weren't treated as delicate and would spend a lot of time outside family structures, sometimes fostered out as domestic servants or to be brought up by nursemaids. Now, this book caused a huge amount of controversy and created a whole cottage industry of medieval scholars rebutting the thesis. I'm in no position to make any meaningful contribution to this debate. However, from a purely anthropological and biological perspective, a society where parents fail consistently to build true emotional bonds with their children would find it simply hard to function. And as for children wearing adult clothes and portraits, well, 2 things spring to mind. 1, do even the adults wear these clothes every day? Well, of course not. They have themselves painted in their Sunday best, and so are their children. The fact that my kids' school photos show them wearing jackets and tie and a demure skirt or blouse, well, that sadly does not mean that they called me sir and that they made sure that they were seen but not heard. And when it comes to the lack of records about childhood in literature, we have to remember that paper only began spreading around Europe in the 14th century. The first German paper mill opened in Nuremberg in 1390, and in England it took until 1490 for paper to be produced there. And vellum, as we heard in the Gutenberg episode, was extraordinarily expensive. Hence, what adults wrote down were the things adults found most important: theology, history, politics, science, and chivalric romance. And most of these adults who wrote things down were clerics who lived in religious houses without children. So, concluding from the absence of reports about childhood games that medieval parents did not love their children is the same as saying the lack of articles in the Financial Times covering the subjects of kids playing in the mud proves that bankers are bad fathers. Well, they may be, but it's not the journalist's fault. So on the balance of probability, I would say that medieval mums and dads loved and cared about their children as much as we do, and that the terrible child mortality is what left them with a lot more grief to deal with than we have to do today. But there's one thing I do agree with Aries about, which is that the way children and childhood are depicted and recorded changed in the 15th century, and quite profoundly. The childhood of the future Emperor Maximilian I lies exactly in this transition period, which is why we have a record of it, a record that may help us understand the man and the political actor he became. Maximilian of Habsburg was born on Maundy, Thursday, of the year 1459 in the east tower of the castle of Wiener Neustadt. When he was in his late 30s, he asked the humanist and writer Josef Grünpeck to effectively ghostwrite his autobiography, The History of Friedrich and Maximilian. And in this, let's say, mildly embellished account, the newborn Maximilian, when washed in his tiny bathtub, for a very brief moment, stood up. Which is not quite as impressive as Hercules strangling snakes as a newborn, but still a clear sign of great power and great glory ahead. And so he needed to receive a grand and powerful name. Constantinople had fallen just 6 years earlier, and though Friedrich III famously did nothing about it, he, as emperor, was now officially responsible for getting it back. Hence Constantine would be a most suitable name for his eldest son and heir. Several of his siblings would end up with Byzantine names like Helena, John, and Christoph. Another option was George, after Saint George, the hero of Christian chivalry and patron of the knightly order Friedrich III founded a few years later. But the emperor went for the name of a local Austrian saint, Maximilian of Lorch, a missionary who was decapitated when he refused to abandon Christianity in the 3rd century. As far as saints go, he is about as local and as obscure as you can get. Still, he had appeared to Friedrich III in a dream, and had saved him in one of his very few battles. And that is why we now have so many Maximilians. My grandfather was a Max, and it is a top 50 name in Germany, even in the UK. Chances are you have a Max in the family. And now you know where the name comes from. A dream of the imperial arch-sleepyhead. Even if young Max did not stand up at birth, physical strength and dexterity was a key theme in his childhood and later life. His father, despite being tall and broad-shouldered, had always been, well, a bit flabby. Not so his son. Maximilian came much after his grandfather, and even more after his grandmother. Ernst the Iron had been a legendary warrior, a master in the handling of all weaponry, and given his moniker, was never out of his armor. And his wife, Maximilian's grandmother, the legendary Symburga of Mazovia, the alluring daughter of a Polish duke, and famously strong, able to bend horseshoes and push nails into walls with her bare hands. But long before he could show any physical prowess himself, the future emperor was thoroughly traumatized, as Friedrich III's reign hit its low point. The week in the Hofburg in 1463, hiding from the cannonballs down in the cellar, left him with a constant fear of being overpowered, a need to be stronger and more aggressive, fending off attacks as hard as he could. He never openly dismissed his father, but Master Grünpeck had to marshal all his remarkable faculties to make Friedrich III look powerful and admirable. He declared that the old emperor had become all-powerful thanks to his cunning and conniving, playing the disloyal princes one against the other so he could punish his enemies without a single stroke of the sword. But then Maximilian writes that his father had again and again allowed traitors who had spread malicious rumors and insults get away with no more than a mild dressing down, saying that the tongues are meant to be free and should not be constrained by the law. What he called the patience of the emperor compelled his mother, the formidable Eleanor of Portugal, to say to her husband, quote, "You are not worth covering your shame with a loincloth as long as you do not punish crimes with all severity. By not doing so, you are just opening the floodgates to mischief." Maximilian writes that this was said in jest, but hey, if I was from the most illustrious family of Portuguese kings and navigators, and my husband got me shot at by some plebs and eat porridge for weeks, I would not be joking about sending him out in the cold without underpants. And deep down it seems that is what Maximilian thought as well. It is quite evident that Maximilian's attachment to his mother had been much closer than that to his father. Eleanor was a lot livelier, sometimes volatile, and definitely more exciting than his sedate, considerate father. As was common for noble families, Maximilian was almost immediately handed over to nursemaids and nannies to be brought up. It was a Habsburg tradition that the small children ate and played with the children of the servants. We even have a small drawing of little Maximilian, complete with archducal hat, being fed alongside the other children in the household of Wiener Neustadt. And these relationships with the common people seem to have remained beyond childhood and shaped him. Maximilian turned out to be one of these people who can talk to anyone, be it a bishop, a banker, a baker, or a beggar. Sure, he was a Habsburg and he believed his family was predestined to rule the world. He adopted A-E-I-O-U, his father's weird motto, that became Alles Erdreich ist Österreich untertan. He knew for a fact that there had been 95 lords of Austria going back to Noah, and that Caesar and Nero had elevated the archduchy to the most venerable province of the Roman Empire. But at the same time, he was never haughty or condescending. The word that was most often used to describe him was leutselig, which is usually translated as affable or amiable, but has an additional component of really enjoying the company of others, of the Leute, of the people. And that is always, and for everyone, a hugely valuable thing. But given Maximilian's almost entire lack of hard power, it was these soft skills that helped him build the Habsburg-Burgundian Empire. Once he had come out of the nursery, he turned into a wild child, exploring the castle of Wiener Neustadt, its stables, armories, walls and ditches, large forests and the gardens his father so fastidiously catered for. Coming along on these quests were now the sons of the local nobility, many of whom became friends for life. There was even a Turkish prince, Omar Calixte, allegedly a half-brother of Mehmed the Conqueror amongst his circle. But this is not the court of Louis XIV with levées and courtiers shuffling backwards out of the room. In his daily life, Friedrich III was a modest man, and so was the little court he gave to his son. There was simple food, hearty games, and true friendship. Still, a shadow hung over this image of an idyllic, or, as my son would say, wholesome childhood. Maximilian barely spoke until he was 6 years old, and even later was closed off with his parents and teachers. Most historians ascribe this to the way he was schooled. We are now in the early modern period, and an illiterate prince has become inconceivable. As Friedrich III himself said, an uneducated monarch is nothing but a crowned ass. Children were hence introduced to the key elements of the medieval education, the trivium and then the quadrivium, i.e. first logic, grammar and rhetoric, and then arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy. The first three were the stumbling block, since what these highfalutin terms, logic, grammar and rhetoric, actually meant was learning Latin, and that meant learning the Donatus, that Latin textbook that was amongst the very first things that Gutenberg ever printed. Maximilian's mother had approached an eminent humanist to teach her son, using the book on education that the old family friend Aeneas Silvio Piccolomini had produced. But Friedrich did not trust anyone with his son, except for his loyal Styrians. The first of his teachers was okay, but the second one was a harsh man. Corporal punishment was common on so many levels, including in schooling, and, with his father's permission, his preceptor, Peter Engelbrecht, beat little Maximilian hard whenever his Latin vocab or grammar fell behind the standards that were expected. Once, when lightning struck the castle, Maximilian laughed at his teacher's startled expression, and for that he was slapped as well. The net effect was that he never learned really good Latin. Though he became fluent in Slovenian, French, Flemish, English, even Spanish, not through books, but by talking to lords, ladies, labourers and Landsknechten, and he kept a grudge for his old schoolmaster for the rest of his life. To escape the horrors of the schoolroom, he fled to his mother's chambers, where he was fed sweets and presumably got the warmth and the love his father did not convey to him as easily. In fact, his parents had a massive row over Eleanor's habit of giving the kids candy. The emperor accused her of stuffing them to death, and of their 5 children, 3 indeed died. When Maximilian's sister Kunigunde got sick, Friedrich personally cared for her, limiting her to his modest and presumably healthier diet. One can only imagine little Maximilian's pain as his mother died when he was just 8 years old. Eleanor barely made it to 30 and succumbed to some sort of stomach ailment, possibly cancer, which suggests Maximilian witnessed her slow and agonizing death. He venerated his mother for the rest of his life. Depictions of her in his commissions made her resemble a saint, even the Virgin, rather than a real-life person. As he grew older, he escaped the clutches of Peter Engelbrecht and experienced a more enjoyable form of learning. He had an unknown instructor who taught him drawing and calligraphy. That was far more up his street, and as we will find out, Maximilian became an extremely knowledgeable patron of the graphic arts, and even more astute at utilizing imagery in his political aims. His next set of teachers helped him develop more of an interest in the subjects of higher learning, in particular in history and politics. It's often said that he never developed much aptitude with numbers, leaving him prey to the economic genius of Jakob Fugger. I've read various opinions about that, and so we should leave this subject until we get to it. One of the reasons there's debate about what he did or did not learn has to do with the way Maximilian managed his image. As we will see, propaganda and PR were crucial in the way he operated politically, and part of that propaganda were various accounts he commissioned of his early life. We've already talked about Grünpeck's History of Friedrich and Maximilian, which is a highly flattering but otherwise more traditional chronicle. Maximilian later commissioned a rhymed poem called the Teuerdank, a sort of chivalric romance where a young prince has to master various challenges, defeat evil opponents and resist temptations to be worthy to marry the rich princess in the west, where obviously Teuerdank is Maximilian and the princess is Mary of Burgundy. Towards the end of his life, he commissioned another book, another way for him to create a mythology about himself. This book is called the Weißkönig, which is a witty play with words, as it means both the White King as well as the Wise King. But that is pretty much the only witty thing about it. In 251 woodcuts, the reader is introduced to a fictitious Maximilian, who is a mix of Jesus, Aristotle, Archimedes, Hercules, Thomas Aquinas, Michelangelo, Mozart, and even Nicolas Flamel. This mega Maximilian is a total genius, disputes with wise men in a brace of languages, helps painters to find their style, builders to improve the sturdiness of their houses, teaches armorers how to harden the steel, plays music better than the greatest musicians. In short, he's a totally insufferable know-it-all. This book covers Maximilian's life well into the Italian wars, or as he described them, the war against the King of Fish, aka the Doge of Venice. In a way, he was lucky this self-magnification, set in scene through the much more magnificent woodcuts of Hans Burgkmair, was only published long after his death. All this material, however, makes it harder rather than simpler to figure out how he actually grew up and what he actually learned. But even if he did not excel in intellectual pursuits as much as he later in life pretended to have done, it is obvious that Maximilian was a man who loved, and I mean really loved, physical activity, adventure, and blowing things up. From early on, he and his group of friends spent most of their time riding horses, hunting with dogs and falcons, training for the dozens of different forms people could hurt each other in tournaments, even getting to grips with handguns and cannon. One time Maximilian had hoarded enough gunpowder that he could have blown up the bombard and himself, but luckily someone found out and stopped him. Aged 6, he got his first set of armor that he wore with pride around the courtyards of Wiener Neustadt. As he grew into a teenager, the intellectual education receded more and more into the background, and Maximilian focused on practical topics. That meant for a prince, even in the late 15th century, warfare, both individual fighting skills as well as military strategy, tactics and technology. This he approached with the mindset of an encyclopedia, a comprehensive compendium of all the available information about a subject. For example, much later, though, he commissioned the Freidal, another one of these pseudo-autobiographies, which on the one hand recounts a story of a knight and son of a mighty prince trying to win the heart of 3 beautiful ladies. But it is also an exhaustive tableau of 2 things: tournament techniques and mummery. There are 256, well actually 255 miniature pictures depicting 64 tournaments, which involve all conceivable forms of simulated combat on horseback and on foot, and a variety of evening entertainments, usually masked balls or wild dances featuring all kinds of costumes and dance moves. There's even one where the men wear the women's clothing, just to prove that there's really nothing new under the sun. But at age 14, if he could have looked into his head, what he would have found, above all, were the chivalric romances, the tales of Percival and Lancelot, of Tristan and Siegfried. He was a boy who loved sport, who loved armor, weapons, and above all, adventure. In what world would he not have seen himself as the 15th century equivalent of a superhero, of a chivalric knight out on his quest to slay dragons and gain the heart of the lady of his dreams? All this sounds very medieval, or actually late medieval. All this talk of chivalry, fighting techniques, and damsels in distress may get one to believe that Maximilian was as conservative and as backward-looking as his father. But there's also another side to him. He was fascinated by technology, not just military technology. From his earliest days, he visited the workshops of armorers, gunsmiths, printers, painters, any kind of metalworkers. He learned about mining, smelting, minting of coins, architecture, metallurgy of any kind. He's excited about geology, in particular precious stones. He shared his father's interest in what he called the black arts, alchemy, astrology, mysticism, even necromancy. Though the claims in the Weisskönig are hugely exaggerated, there remains the fact that he had more understanding of modern topics of manufacturing and economics than many of his contemporaries. And that same dichotomy is observable when it comes to religion. His mother had imbued him with a deep personal piety, whilst his father taught him to use the organization of the church as part of his revenue base. So Maximilian became a man who would passionately dream of going on crusade, or at least do a pilgrimage to Jerusalem as his father and grandfather had done, whilst at the same time diverting the funds collected for the recovery of Constantinople to pay down his personal debts. In 1471 and 1473, Maximilian is for the first time introduced to the wider world of the empire. He travelled with his father from Styria to the imperial diets at Augsburg. There he saw the grand princes of the empire competing in spectacular tournaments. To get an idea on what that may have looked like, check out the unbelievable exuberance of the armor, dresses and fancy headgear in the Triumph of Maximilian by Hans Burgkmair and his son. And at the same time, the city itself impressed young Maximilian. Augsburg was one of the centers of art and industry in the German lands, a kind of late medieval Silicon Valley, New York and Hollywood rolled into one. The place where some of the greatest armorers had their workshops, some of the best painters and sculptors produced mind-boggling beauty, Merchants were trading wares from Venice, Novgorod, Lisbon and London, and bankers were setting up their stalls ready to compete with the Lombards. Augsburg would become Maximilian's favorite city, the place he would spend more time in than anywhere else, save for his capital in Innsbruck. The King of France would later mock him as the mayor of Augsburg. And then in 1473 in Trier, he met the embodiment of this last gasp of chivalric culture, Charles the Bold, the Grand Duke of the West. If the imperial princes in Augsburg had been impressive already, this guy was next level. The clothes, the armor, the pearls, the precious stones, the tapestries, all and everything, 10, 15, 20 times bigger, more beautiful, more sophisticated. Sure, his father had something he called 100,000 guilders coat and an impressive collection of gemstones, but really, could that compete with the grandeur of Burgundy? And Charles had fought in dozens of battles in the midst of the action, taking daring decisions his advisors had told him not to. What a contrast to his hesitant, slow and miserly father. Maximilian was like an Austrian kart racer meeting Lando Norris or James Hunt for those of an older generation. Of course, Maximilian thought Charles the Bold was the business. Charles invited him to one-on-one meetings. They talked about war and weapons and armies. And Charles gave him a beautifully decorated copy of his military manual, a copy that still exists. And then Maximilian was to marry the daughter of his hero. It does not get any better than that. Well, or could it? Maximilian would never again sit down with Charles of Burgundy. He would later write that he had met him and Mary of Burgundy before Neuss in 1475, but that meeting never took place. During that war, Maximilian was kept under the protection of the Bishop of Augsburg, a long way from the front line. Meanwhile, as Charles' fortunes darkened, the need to settle the marriage contract between Maximilian and Marie of Burgundy became ever more pressing. Charles had few friends left, having disappointed King Edward IV of England and alienated pretty much all his neighbours. A positive relationship with Friedrich III and the Empire was his way to balance out King Louis XI of France. He could no longer insist on a crown for his lands of Burgundy as a precondition for the betrothal, and so in 1476 he set a date for the ceremony. We know why he did not make it to the event, but as far as the lawyers were concerned, the Habsburg-Burgundian merger was ready and good to go. News of the disastrous battles of Grandson, of Murten, and finally Nancy reached Austria throughout 1476 and 77, so one would expect that Maximilian set off for Ghent as soon as he had heard of Charles' demise. But he could not. Friedrich III and Maximilian were by now back home in Austria. Matthias Hunyadi, the King of Hungary and leader of a standing army, even larger than that of Charles of Burgundy, was attacking their homeland. Matthias, the Raven King, the bulwark of Christendom against the oncoming Turkish flood, had actually made peace with the Sultan and was seeking land and wealth in the west. His first target had been Bohemia, where Georg of Podiebrad reigned over a fragile alliance of moderate Hussites and Catholics. The continued existence of these Utraquists, whose theological differences to the Orthodox Catholicism had narrowed down to the right to take the Eucharist in the form of both bread and wine, kept irritating Rome. Pope Paul II excommunicated Georg of Podiebrad in 1468 and then tasked Matthias Hunyadi, King of Hungary, to remove the heretic and force Bohemia back into the bosom of Mother Church. But the shiny army of the Raven King struggled to knock down the Hussite Wagenburgs. He had taken over half the country, Moravia and Silesia, the parts that had traditionally been Catholic, and had himself crowned King of Bohemia, but he could not make his way to Prague. Even the death of Georg of Podiebrad in 1471 did not change that. The Bohemian barons called in the brother of the King of Poland, and the war kept going. Throughout the 1470s, Friedrich III got sucked into this war. It was obvious that Matthias had his eye on Austria. Whenever the war in Bohemia will end, Matthias's forces would go for Vienna. Now, so far Matthias had not attacked, but he had let Turkish raiding parties cross his land to pillage Austria. But since 1474, he was piling on the pressure, gradually opening hostilities. Matthias formally declared war on Austria in June 1477, a war that would last until 1490. These issues in Bohemia and Hungary were the reason Friedrich III and Maximilian were off the scene in the west after the siege of Neuss. Which also meant that when Charles the Bald had his head split open in a snowstorm outside Nancy, Maximilian was hundreds of miles away from his intended bride, and that was bad, because she really, really needed him. Charles the Bald's rule of his lands was built on the still smouldering ruins of the cities of Dinant and Liège. The grand centralization he had forced through the estates and the court at Mechelen was accepted only out of fear. And when Charles the Bald was no more, there was no more fear, and no longer did the cities or the territories recognize the central power. King Louis XI of France, whose elaborate plan to wipe out this dangerous enemy had come to fruition in ways far beyond his wildest dreams, and he was now moving on the young heiress, Marie of Burgundy. The situation was extremely precarious. Ghent was in open revolt. Marie's chief minister was beheaded before her very eyes. New suitors were circling the ducal palace, including the famously ugly Dauphin of France, the future Charles VIII. Maximilian's bride was in a clear and imminent danger. Her knight in shining armour had to saddle his horse and ride out to rescue her. His own lands, the Raven King, his ailing father, they'll all be damned. This is when it can get no better. A knight's crest is on. Maximilian, slim but strong, clad in the finest armour, trained in warfare to within an inch of his life, heads out for his grand adventure to gain his kingdom. Which is where we leave him for now. Next week the two lovers will finally meet, and the war to preserve her and her inheritance will kick off. Whilst back home in Austria, the armoured knights, the disciplined infantry, and the mighty cannon of the Raven King push for Vienna. I hope you're going to join us again. And if you find yourself touched by this story and you wish for you and your fellow listeners to enjoy the first encounter of the great lovers of the 15th century without me having to make deeply inappropriate references to mattresses, you know where to go and you know what to do.